Informed Choice episode 236 with Linnea Dunne, author of Lagom.
A lot of people are very, very busy at the moment, so concepts like Hygge and Lagom are very topical or timely, I think. It encapsulates the whole value system of life in Sweden, and Hygge doesn't really do that at all. I don't think I met anyone who has decided consciously, okay, I'm going to try to cut back on what I spend or the kind of levels of how busy I am and how much stuff I buy, who aren't happier.
Sundial House Studios in Cranley, welcome to Informed Choice Radio. This is the podcast all about achieving your financial goals in life. Here's your host, Martin Bamford.
We've all become a little bit obsessed with Scandinavian culture. IKEA has overtaken John Lewis as our favourite shop. TV audiences are enthralled with Nordic noir, and everyone is lighting candles to bring a bit of Hygge into their lives. The latest concept about to hit the UK from Sweden is Lagom. Lagom, spelt Lagom, has got no equivalent in the English language, but it's loosely translated as not too little, not too much, just right. It's widely believed that the word comes from the Viking term laget, for when a mug of mead was passed around a circle and there was just enough for everyone to get a sip. But while the anecdote may hit the nail on the head, the true etymology of the word points to an old form of the word lag, which means law. Far from restrictive, Lagom is a liberating concept. It praises the idea that anything more than just enough is a waste of time. Crucially, it also comes with a selflessness and a core belief of responsibility and common good. By living Lagom, you can live a happier and more balanced life, reduce your environmental impact, improve your work-life balance, free your home from clutter, enjoy good food the Swedish way, grow your own and learn to forage, and cherish the relationships with those you love. My guest on the podcast today is Linnea Dunne, author of Lagom, The Swedish Art of Balanced Living. Linnea was born and raised in Sweden, where she started her writing career as a columnist at the local newspaper aged just 15. She left for Ireland a few years later and eventually moved to London, where she studied creative writing and political communications. She now lives in Dublin with her husband and two half-Swedish kids, trying to achieve that Lagom balance against all the odds. Please do take a moment to say thank you to Linnea on Twitter and let her know that you heard her right here on Informed Choice Radio. You can find Linnea on Twitter at Linnea Dunne. Mention me too at Martin Bamford. You can find the show notes for this episode at icradio.co.uk/Lagom, spelt Lagom. There's useful links, and you can also download the full episode transcript. That's all at icradio.co.uk/Lagom. Here's my conversation with Linnea Dunne in episode 236 of Informed Choice Radio. Could you start by telling our listeners a bit about you and about your background and what it is you do?
I'm born and bred in Sweden and grew up in a small town, a nice little, reasonably picturesque place in Sweden. And I've kind of always been writing. So writing and music were my main things. And I started writing at a young age. And then when I was 19, I moved to Dublin. Initially, I just wanted to get away. It's quite common in Sweden that you go away after secondary school to get a bit of perspective, learn a language or something. So I moved to Dublin and fell in love with the place. And since then, I never really, I tried to move back to Sweden, but ended up coming back. And I've been in London for about 10 years since. I've been studying creative writing and political communications. And now I'm back in Dublin with my Irish husband and two half-Swedish kids. And I work as editor of Scan magazine, which is a showcase for brand Scandinavia. So we work with loads of different Swedish and Scandinavian brands, writing about design, culture, arts, business, everything. And yeah, this is my first book that's due out now in the next month.
Fantastic. And we're talking today about your new book, which is called Lagom, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You'll put me straight if I'm not. The Swedish art of... Was it brilliant? The Swedish art of balanced living. So can we start with a definition? What's the definition of Lagom?
At its most basic, Lagom is about striking a balance of doing things just right. So it's not too little, not too much, but just enough. And that can be as simple as the right amount of milk in your coffee, or it can be about buying the sensible but not too flashy car. It can be a little bit more complex, so a way of doing business or the way you deal with people in work, and all to do with consensus and listening and talking things through.
Okay, and is this a sort of a commonly accepted approach in Sweden? This is something that's been around for a long time?
It's not an approach. So in Sweden, you wouldn't really talk about Lagom as a lifestyle, or as a method or anything. It's a word that happens to encapsulate the Swedish psyche quite well.
Okay.
Now, historically, it's the word comes from an old, I think it's Old Norse maybe, word for the word of law. But it's also linked in with a law from a book, so a fictitious thing called the Law of Jante, which is, I would say, a lot more negative, which is why sometimes people have been criticizing Lagom and saying that it's not actually something to ascribe to. So the Law of Jante tells people not to think too highly of themselves and not to stand out. So it's understandable why the terms are being mixed up. But the word Lagom in itself is more about finding that perfect balance, or finding what really works.
And how does Lagom differ from Hygge, which is obviously the big popular thing that's come across, I think, from Denmark?
Yeah. They're not really, they can't really be compared because they're two very different things. So Hygge is, I can't even pronounce it, sorry, all Danes out there. Hygge is more a feeling, and it's about a moment and being in the moment and lighting candles. It's all cozy. Lagom goes way beyond that. There is Hygge in Lagom as well, except we call it mead in Swedish. So, you'll find that Swedes light a lot of candles and have all the cozy stuff as well. But Lagom also deals with the difficult stuff. It deals with everything from the personal to the political. It encapsulates the whole value system of life in Sweden. And Hygge doesn't really do that at all.
Okay, that's interesting. And we've seen quite a few of these concepts coming across from the Nordic region in recent years, and they seem to have struck a real chord in other countries, particularly here in the UK. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're so keen to learn now about this approach to life, this approach to living, and what you're talking here about, the Swedish art of balanced living? Why is it striking a chord with us?
I think there's been a fascination with the Nordic region for quite some time, from the Nordic noir, the new Nordic cuisine. There's quite a lot of stuff. And as you say, Hygge. I think it's interesting. Obviously, you look at this group of countries in the north that seem to somehow get things right, in the sense that all these countries are ranking reasonably highly in different, in terms of education, in terms of equality, in terms of happiness. So there's that. I mean, there's an obvious reason there, I think. And I bump into a lot of people who say, "Oh, you're Swedish, I love Sweden." And it turns out they've never been, but they have this fascination with Sweden and think it's this magical place. And I think, that's interesting. You would have had that about places like Italy or Spain or whatever, which is kind of understandable. But you're talking about a country up north where there's barely any daylight in the winter and it's freezing cold, So it's kind of, it's funny. It's an interesting one. And I think I was interviewing a Swedish actor there recently who was in the most recent Nordic noir thing to come out of Sweden. And he said, look, there's something mystical behind, or something almost brutal behind these wooden cottages in this lovely Swedish landscape. And I think, there's something in that. I think the fact that we've got these countries that seem to be getting things so right, where life is almost like, well, to some people, it seems like utopia. Despite all this, despite living where it's freezing in the winter and where it's so dark, it's meant to be depressing. How can these people be so happy? I think that's probably fascinating to a lot of people. And then, of course, a lot of people are very, very busy at the moment. So concepts like Hygge and Lagom are very topical or timely, I think.
Are there any sort of simple steps then our listeners could take to introduce more Lagom into their lives, more balance? Overall,
Lagom is kind of about learning to pause and take a step back to reflect. I mean, you can look to Sweden for a lot of for inspiration, I think, in the way Swedes live, because obviously the Lagom is kind of in the Swedish psyche and in the Swedish way of life. But in a bigger picture way, I think it's about that. It's about learning not to just plow on and do things the way you've always done it, but to stop and go, actually, you're in the queue, you're about to buy this thing, and you stop and you realize, I totally, absolutely don't need this. I don't even really know why I want it. And you put it back. So it can be simple things like that. But then also, you know, in a more practical sense, learning to take breaks. And that's so much easier said than done. But the Swedish way of having regular coffee breaks in work, and to really honour those breaks, like that's not just research has shown that that's really good for your productivity and your happiness and everything in between. But it's also, I think, very important for our health. So that's one thing. And the Swedish lifestyle is very keen on fresh air, whether that's going out in the woods or hanging out, going for a skiing trip or something with the family, or having a picnic. So I think the combination of taking breaks, enjoying a bit of fresh air, that's a very Swedish approach to finding balance.
And have you managed to keep up that Swedish lifestyle that you talk about in the book since moving to Dublin and London, back to Dublin again? Is that something you're still doing in your own life?
Well, I'm not going to lie. It's been a bit of a journey recently, especially since taking on this book. I've got 2 young kids and a full-time job, and I've just bought a house and written a book. So it hasn't been very Lagom the last while, if I'm honest. But for me, I have a tendency to take on a lot of projects. I get super excited and take on too much. And what always works for me is that thing of honouring breaks. When I'm so busy that I feel that, okay, there's absolutely not enough hours in the day. If I take a break now, there's no way I'll get on top of things. If I insist on going for a run, if it's half an hour, that's half an hour lost. But it's so much more gained when I come back in increased productivity, increased focus, happiness. You get that lovely endorphin rush. I end up eating healthier later on. I sleep better, all that stuff. So that's something that definitely works for me. And then I suppose I'm a bit of a systems person. I'm addicted to planning food in advance. We do online shoppings on a weekly basis, and it's very much the system that's there in the background. It just runs. We don't have to think about it. Just making that easy, making the kind of the necessary evils, if you like, easy for yourself.
And that ties in a bit to my next question, I guess, because I was wondering how Lagom might apply to personal finances. Do you think that there's too much striving out there at the moment when it comes to work and money, too much trying to accumulate more rather than being satisfied with having enough of what we've currently got? We
live in a world that tells us to do so. So absolutely, I think so. And I think that doesn't only apply to finances, but also to this idea of self-realization. So we're striving for more, not just to earn more, but to have better titles in work, or to tick more boxes so we can tell people on social media what we're doing. And I think, that's okay, and that's absolutely understandable. But at the same time, I don't think I've ever met anyone, and obviously this is taking aside people who are struggling, who don't have enough money, obviously, but I don't think I've met anyone who has decided consciously, okay, I'm going to try to cut back on what I spend, or the kind of levels of how busy I am and how much stuff I buy, who aren't happier afterwards. You've probably heard about the minimalist movement. So the people who give away loads of stuff and maybe even just sell everything, bar what they can fit in a backpack, and go traveling. And I think it's a really addictive thing for a lot of people. It's this sense of freedom from being kind of connected to and dependent on these material possessions. And I mean, that's not a typically Swedish thing to do, but I think there's a lot to be said for stopping and not just consuming because that's what we're expected to do, but to think about what we actually really want and what happens inside when we stop and go, okay, what do we do when we're not out buying stuff, when we're not out, I don't know, running around like crazy, when we're sitting down over a cup of tea together and light a candle.
And I think it's fair to say that in Sweden there's a much healthier approach to work-life balance. You don't have as many workaholics in Sweden who might be putting in sort of 80, 100-hour weeks. So is that a big difference as well? Is that something that contributes, do you think, to the art of balanced living?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't know if I can subscribe to that view, but I would say that it's easier in Sweden to take your work very seriously and still strike that balance, because right. I think generally speaking, the view that, workers who get to leave work on time and who get to have a lot of quality time with their family and friends and who get to explore their creative hobbies and stuff are generally happier and better workers. So, for example, now, if you went to Sweden now, you'd see that the whole country is about to shut down, pretty much, because people get at least 4 weeks holidays pretty much in the summers.
Oh, wow.
And just head to the country or whatever with their family. So today, actually, it's Midsummer's Eve in Sweden. So this is kind of the kickoff. And everyone's today out dancing around a maypole and drinking schnapps and singing songs. And then for the rest of the summer, people are just outdoors, whether it's sunny or raining or whatever else. People are just out enjoying time with their family. And I think, it's so much easier to be good at your job and to be passionate about your job without it breaking you and without it becoming too much. If you get very good holidays, if you have very good, sick pay, if the system is in place for you to be at home with a kid who's sick and you don't lose a lot of money and your work colleagues aren't going to look at you and think that you're not taking your work seriously. Mm. So I think there's that. You mentioned earlier one of the sort of measures of success we see from these Nordic countries is equality, gender equality in particular. And I know that that's a big part of society in Sweden and other Nordic countries too. You describe yourself as an anarcha-feminist. So I wonder how you feel that equality forms part of Lagom. Yeah, I don't actually describe myself as an anarcha-feminist. I know, though, that I write about it on my website. I was reading a lot about it recently, and I think it was a bit of a hint as to my ideological stance generally. But I'm a feminist, absolutely. And I don't see that we can talk about balance without equality, really. And obviously, gender equality is a huge part of that, but it goes for all kinds of equality, I think. And historically, Sweden has a very good track record of looking after people across the board, so for the past 100 or so years, you've had a very strong welfare state, you've had, free schooling for all, you've had very good, generous parental leave recently, and also subsidised childcare. So I suppose you have a lot of people, a huge middle class, that have it reasonably well. And I think that means that you bring everyone along, not just in terms of gender equality, but also in terms of economic equality, in terms of different groups and refugees coming. And, it's far from utopia, but I think that's really, really important. Linnea, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Before you go, how can our listeners find out more about you online? And most importantly, where can they buy a copy of your book? Well, they can find me on all the usual platforms. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff. My website is my name, linneadunne.com, and they can find a link to where to buy the book there as well. But they can also just go to Amazon and search for the book. If they search Lagom, I think it comes up top, I hope. Hopefully, good stuff. Okay, we'll make sure we put links to all of that into the show notes today as well, so our listeners can find it all nice and easily. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks a million. Thanks for having me. A big thank you to Linnea for joining me on Informed Choice Radio today. What was your favourite part of that conversation? You can let me know on Twitter at Martin Bamford, or in the comments section in the show notes for this episode at icradio.co.uk/lagom. That's also where you can find useful links and the full transcript for this episode. That's icradio.co.uk/lagom, spelt Lagom. Don't forget to say a quick thank you to Linnea on Twitter, where you can find her at Linnea Dunne. Before you go, please do take a moment to share this podcast episode with a friend on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. If you're listening through a podcast player, just hit the share button. That's the easiest way. Each time you share an episode on social media, it helps to boost us up the podcasting charts, and that helps us to reach even more new listeners. And if you've not done so before, please do leave us a quick review on iTunes. Visit icradio.co.uk/iTunes. That takes you straight to our page. If you click on the tab that says ratings and reviews, you can leave us your 5-star rating and a short review there. It just needs to be a few words, and we read out every review in a future episode of this podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you so much for your continued support of this podcast. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.